This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Yo.
And our special guest, Chad.
I have my bag of dice and giant soda bottle ready.
That's so Canadian, Chad. Tonight, we are going to be talking about role-playing games, specifically tabletop role-playing games, something that Don, Chad, and I all have in common. We all played them when we were younger. We all played them for probably about maybe up to 20 years of our lives. And we thought that we'd do kind of an overview of what tabletop role-playing games are, where they came from, what our experiences were with them, and where they've gone, and maybe where they're going. So this is going to be a bit of an overview episode, and then later on we'll probably do some more specific episodes about, say, things like fantasy gaming or horror gaming or other things like that. But we want to just kind of touch on the subject in general first and talk about our own experiences. You okay with that, guys?
Yeah, sure.
I can live with that.
Yep, okay, sounds good. All right, so on that note, Dawn, why don't you tell us, what's a tabletop role-playing game?
The easiest way, I think, and this is kind of ironic, is to go backwards, because everybody's familiar with computer role-playing games, where you'll make up a character, say a team, you go out, you do things, as you do things, your characters gain some kind of points. As they gain points, they level up, they get new abilities, their stats go up, etc., etc., etc. Tabletop role-playing game is that without the computer.
My God, what do you use instead of the computer? How can you do things without a computer?
Well, the way they work is one person takes the role of that the computer would be doing, and that would be your game master or dungeon master or keeper of arcane lore or storyteller, whatever. Every game basically has a different term for it. And that's the person that comes up with the adventure. They would run all of the non-player characters. They arbitrate the application of the rules. And then all of the other participants would make up one character who would be like your character in a video game or a character in a movie. And they run that character through the scenarios the game master creates and provides.
That sounds about right, yeah. It's basically a giant game of Let's Pretend.
Yeah.
With someone actually acting as a referee.
Yeah, basically.
Or just, you can think of it as like a game of Monopoly where you can kill each other.
You could think of it that way, too, and that's happened a few times.
Guess you guys never did that in your Monopoly games?
Not usually, Don, but...
Jeez, Rob, how did you play Monopoly?
Well, we played it cutthroat, but cutthroat in the business sense, not cutthroat in the literal sense. What kind of cards did you have, that involve... Oh, never mind. I don't want to know. All right. So, since you've gone forward and back again, let's start again at the beginning and go with this. So, the first official role-playing game, at least as they're considered, was, of course, Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah.
Or was it Chainmail at that time? No, Chainmail was the war game, and then D&D was the role-playing version, correct?
Yeah, you've kind of hit on... an important and kind of mercurial distinction is there's tabletop role-playing games, tabletop war games. The war games came first.
Yes.
And they worked very similar, because you've mentioned Chainmail. That was a straight-up war game, and in a war game, each participant would build up a force. Like, you don't generally control one character. You'd have a team or a group or an army, and you'd fight it out.
Right.
And everybody is competing against each other, and the rules arbitrate that. That's one of the big differences. In a role-playing game, you usually only have one character,
Right.
and you're not generally fighting the rest of the group. It's like the characters in a movie. You're supposed to be working together towards a common goal.
In theory.
In theory, yes.
In reality, as all three of us know, that did not always occur.
No.
But in theory, yes. We were all supposed to be working together, and we are all supposed to be trying to accomplish some kind of common goal and our own personal goals, depending on the nature of the game.
True.
There are games that, of course, that are competitive.
Yeah.
Of course, tabletop wargaming technically goes back to, like, that would be Go, probably. Wei Chi, depending on what you want to call it, which could technically be considered the first tabletop war game. At least it's the oldest one that we know of anyway. There might be older ones.
Yeah.
It would eventually evolve to chess. And in the beginning of the 20th century, H.G. Wells, who was famous for War of the Worlds, also wrote one of the very first tabletop war game manuals called Little Wars, I believe it was called.
Yep.
And that was written basically for people to use their toys, like little tin soldiers, to have little floor wars with and blow the crap out of each other.
Yep. There's one older.
There is one older.
Yeah, generally the progenitor for what we think of a tabletop war game would be a Kriegspiel.
Kriegspiel, that just sounds awesome.
It kind of was. It was. I think it comes out from around the Napoleonic era, and it was rules for modern warfare. It was an attempt to take actual war and break it down into stats, and then it was meant as a way for military officers to develop their leadership skills by actually fighting the wars out.
Makes sense. I'm surprised that there weren't earlier versions, or maybe there probably were, but they were passed on by maybe oral tradition instead of written down.
Yeah, they could. Kriegspiel is generally considered the first of them.
Okay, I bow to your nerdly historical knowledge. All right, then. So let's jump back forward in time. So, in the early 1970s, Gary Gygax and Dave Armisen, I believe it is, basically started playing this game that they called Chainmail, which was a standard miniatures war game, but they started adding fantasy elements to it that were basically right out of Lord of the Rings. It was basically an attempt to do Lord of the Rings, the tabletop war game. And then eventually they expanded it to include, like, kind of stats, and decided to create this dungeoneering version where the characters would go into a dungeon and, like, fight monsters and such, I believe it went. And that basically turned itself into Dungeons & Dragons Zero Edition, or whatever you want to call it, which very few people have seen, I think. It's actually three digest size, I can't even call them paperbacks. They're like really thick pamphlets, basically.
Yeah, kinda. You're talking what's usually called the white box version.
Is that what that's called? Okay.
Yeah, that was the very first one.
Because I have seen them. A mutual friend of Chad and mine actually had copies of them, though God knows what he did with them. They probably got thrown out long ago, even though they're mega collector's items probably at this point. But somehow his parents, who were garage sailors, managed to snag a couple. So I actually do remember sitting there looking at them. But of course I didn't think much of them at the time because we were already like at AD&D by that point. But we'll get to that in a little bit.
Right.
All right, so they create Dungeons & Dragons. It goes on to be a hit. And suddenly college kids all across the United States are playing Dungeons & Dragons, casting magic spells with dice, and worshipping Satan.
Well, that comes a little later. Because D&D was kind of just like, I don't want to say a cult thing, because that gives the wrong idea.
There we go. See, yeah. The truth has been revealed, children. The truth has been revealed.
Because that was, when I started playing around 77, 78. Mm-hmm. It was still pretty much like an unknown thing.
Not 6676?
Yeah. Well, that comes when you get to like 79, 80, when the protests started and we found out it was bad for you. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden it took off and it was everywhere.
Well, because anything that's bad for you is awesome.
Yep.
At least according to the
wasn't that sparked? Wasn't that sparked by that kid going nuts on the university campus?
Yes, it was. Yeah. Although, again, in the end, we did a whole episode on that, of course, D&D and Satanism, but it basically amounted to that the kid disappeared. He had like major issues. And the one private investigator his parents hired said, well, he plays D&D. Maybe it has something to do with that. And he said it to the local media. Now, he didn't even know what D&D
really?
was.
I actually heard, I remember reading about this, and I think it was the parents that had sort of had put forth this idea that D&D had caused it. And the private investigator, after doing his investigation, went, no, it isn't. It has nothing to do with that. And they're like, yeah, well, we like that idea better, so we'll go to the media with that. Like, I heard even the detective said there was really nothing, there was no correlation between the two.
Okay, there might be, that's not the story I heard or read, but it's possible that could be correct. Either way, it was complete BS. But it was still enough that the media ran with it, and suddenly D&D was the most evil thing ever. Mm-hmm. All right, so for each of us, I assume D&D was our first game. Is that correct? Chad, was it your first game?
Oh, it was for me, yes. Yep. Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm assuming it was for... Well, yeah, it was for me. It was for you, too.
Yeah,
right?
D&D was the first game. Technically, of course, AD&D, because we'll get to that in a second. But because I'm a second-generation gamer. And I assume, Don, same for you?
Yeah, except mine was the first one we played here was the weird... Everybody remembers the red box, basic D&D?
That was mine.
Yep. And the white box is the first one. There was kind of a weird... I've seen it referred to as like the blue box version that came between.
Right. Actually, I think that was mine, actually. I think mine was the blue box.
Yeah, well, there's the blue box that was the expert rules that were the second part of the red, like the red ones.
Right.
And then there's one, it has a dragon rearing up, so its wings are kind of like a T.
Right.
And a bunch of little guys scrambling. That was the one that we started with here.
Oh, okay. See, when I was a kid, I remember seeing the box it was actually in the toy store. It was nestled in with all the other games, like, Monopoly and Sorry and all these other ones, and there it was. And so I asked my parents for it, and they bought it for me for Christmas, and I immediately, upon opening it, had no idea what the hell it was.
Right.
Like, I didn't understand it until I had to sit down and gave it a couple of reads and went, oh, okay. And then immediately realized it's like, oh, you need people to play this with. Like, you can't kind of play it
by yourself.
Like, you have to have other like-minded people that also understand the game to play it. So it was actually a few years before I actually got the opportunity to play with some people that I knew at school.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I played it at friend's birthday party. A friend actually had a birthday party, and I was, maybe 11 or 12, and they pulled out this D&D game, and so we all were supposed to play. And to be honest, I didn't like it at all. I thought it was like the most boring, stupid thing ever.
Weird.
Yeah, I know. I really didn't like it at all. But I thought, okay, fine, I'll go along with this. It wasn't until years later, but we'll get to that another type of role that I found a kind of role playing that really touched my heart. How about you, Don? How did you get into? So what was your first exposure to D&D then?
Well, I'm just thinking. I don't know if you guys watch Gravity Falls.
Oh yeah.
Have you seen?
Not me. Sorry.
Because Rob is pretty much just like living the D&D episode of that. It combines all the fun of homework with doing your taxes.
Yep.
Yeah.
You gotta try this, Grunkle Stan. It's like lying. Yeah.
It's a really great episode that you can tell the people that worked on it like clearly had a background in playing these kind of games.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you can those are always giveaways when you see that done in the show, and it's clear that the people behind the episode had no idea what the hell it was. Whereas this thing rings so true, it's almost terrifying.
Well, wait a sec. Wasn't Gravity Falls done by Dan Harmon?
No, you're thinking of Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty. I thought that Dan Harmon had something to do with Gravity Falls. Well, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think Gravity Falls is... I can't remember his name now. The guy who created it.
Because I know Dan Harmon was involved with Community, and Community had D&D episodes to it.
Yes, they did.
No, it's Alex Hirsch is the name of the guy.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm wrong. I'm off. Sorry. my bad. But here, I mean, these guys are from our generation, right?
Yeah.
And people of our generation tended to, almost everyone of our generation, like I would say the majority of people at least tried it once. They might not have done it on a regular basis, but they at least tried it. Because for a while there, it was the in thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd say try, but they would have at least heard of it or knew somebody who played. Like,
okay, yeah.
it wasn't a weird, mysterious thing.
Exactly. So D&D exploded, did very
Yeah.
well, which of course led to a whole bunch of imitators.
Yeah.
There were several imitators to go along with it. Let's see, what were the early ones? So we had Traveller, which was the first science fiction role-playing game.
Nope. The first science fiction role-playing game was Metamorphosis Alpha.
Oh, you're right, it was, wasn't it?
Which hardly anybody had ever heard of, which is why
You're
everybody...
right, okay. And most people who are listening to this probably don't even know what Metamorphosis Alpha is. I mean,
might...
I was going to say, Don, is that why most people quote Traveller as the first one?
That's probably why.
They did for a bit, but Metamorphosis Alpha had a comeback. Mm-hmm. If you look at the era of gaming, we're currently in like the era of bring back stuff for role-playing games.
Right.
So Metamorphosis Alpha had like 4 editions, and now there's guys who brought back the very original and are doing material for the original one that came out in 1976.
Wow.
And for people that are listening to this, I have no idea what Metamorphosis Alpha is in terms of the story of it or the setting of it. Don, you want to give us a rundown?
It's basically way in the future, humans launch a colony ship out into space. Something goes wrong, the technology, the humans are reduced to like cavemen, and there's mutant monsters that eat them.
All on a big spaceship.
Yeah.
Yep, it's all in a spaceship.
Yeah. And I believe this was this thing it sort of eventually metamorphosized into Gamma World, did it not?
Yes, it did.
Yeah, it did. Yep, that's true.
Yeah, second edition Gamma World did tie it in. But basically, when they did first edition Gamma World, it was the exact same thing, but on the ruins of Earth instead of a spaceship.
Right. So in the original game, like people were wandering around as like mutants and kind of medieval level humans, and not understanding that they were on a spaceship. Essentially, is that the idea?
Yeah, but the original Metamorphosis Alpha, no, you're like cavemen.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like you're way primitive, and any kind of habitation is generally like just a tribe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's super primitive.
Well, the early version of Gamma World were like that too, weren't they? That you generally were tribal.
Yeah, but they added for Gamma World, they added tech level, where you'd have groups that were basically cavemen. You had groups that were kind of at like your primitive agricultural community level, and then you had what would be pretty close to a medieval level society.
Right.
And then for third edition, they added more that would become that you had actually like modern equivalent and little enclaves that technology still worked because they somehow survived the war.
Right.
I'm just thinking to myself that did every game of Metamorphosis Alpha end when one caveman discovers like a picture window on the ship and hits it with his club hard enough to break it?
I never thought of that, but that would be a pretty good.
Yeah, that would be a good ending. Yep. Yep, pretty much. So yeah, basically people tried to make role-playing games right from the beginning of almost everything. So Gamma World was the post-apocalyptic game. Metamorphosis Alpha and Traveller were the science fiction role-playing games. There were superhero role-playing games like Superhero 2099 or 2049. Maybe it's 2049.
49 or 44.
Superhero 2044. I think you're right. I think it's Superhero 2044, which is a set of rules, and the rules for powers were, because I have a copy somewhere. The rules for powers are basically, make some up. You work with the GM and come up with rules for powers yourself. It was pretty threadbare. A better superhero role-playing game, however, was one that is near and dear to my heart, which was Villains and Vigilantes. Which was the game I mentioned earlier that touched my heart.
Yeah, as did I, but it touched my heart as well. But it's funny, Rob and I used to have this weird little stupid nerd debate back in the day, because I was kind of brought up on Villains Vigilantes, and Rob was heavily into Champions, which was another game came shortly after, right? Mm-hmm. And it was a lot. It was a better put together game by comparison. Like Villains Vigilantes has a really wonderful charm to it, and a lot of that comes from the actual material of the game, like their villain source books. They're really, really great, really imaginative.
Amazing,
yeah. It's just the actual system was a little bit odd.
Yep.
It was a little bit clunky, and whereas Champion's system was great, whereas but oddly enough, by comparison, its actual material wasn't. I found anyway.
Yeah.
Like I found like their villain source books were kind of lame. Where
that's true.
the villain vigilante ones were fantastic.
Well, you know why though?
Just very imaginative. Sorry.
Yeah, but you know why that works out that way?
Why?
When you get to a role-playing game, because you kind of accidentally have hit upon one of the I guess you'd say sublimated thoughts when you create a game, is role-playing games you can either simulate the actuality of what goes on in the game or simulate more of the feel of what goes on in the game. And what you got with those two was Villains and Vigilantes, the rules worked really good, and it played just like a 1970s like Marvel comic.
Yep, late 60s, 70s comic. Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Bronze
And
Age.
you could have like gonzo things, and it was another one where you'd get powers like bionics. Well, make something up. Oh, fantastic. But Champions was meant, it was closer to, I don't necessarily want to say realistic, but Champions was meant to simulate more of the physics of what would happen in a superhero world.
Right.
So it was more concise, the rules are more detailed, but because of that, you lose some of that freewheelingness, and I think that was what happens with their characters, is they design them more to fit the game's mechanic ecology, rather than the ultra gonzo wackiness of a 1970s superhero comic.
And
Yeah, but I mean, one thing I liked about Champions, though, having played both of them, and I actually ended up sort of going into the Champions camp.
he came over to the dark side.
I
won.
came over to the dark side. Yeah, Rob won. He totally infiltrated my head. It was just because, from a character generation standpoint, you could a group of players could all play a bunch of characters, and they were all roughly at about the same level in terms of their abilities and their powers and their what have you. Because Villains Vigilantes was relatively loosey-goosey, you could end up with this unfortunate, very wide gap between having like a completely useless character and a god standing right next to him.
Yeah.
And that's fun if you're the god character. It's not so fun when you're the guy with crappy bionics and the ability to change stoplights.
What's interesting though is a few years later they did an actual Marvel superheroes game. And
remember that?
The Marvel game worked really well. It's another really good superhero game, but character creation has that problem you're talking about, but worse.
Oh yeah, totally.
Because it's totally random what your character starts out as, and you can literally have a god, and he's an average guy.
Yeah, you could have Aunt May and the Hulk on the same superhero team in that game.
Well,
in fact, more often than not, you did, or at the very least, you'd have these. Because I remember this specifically, you'd have these hodgepodge of superpowers that didn't really work well with each other. You know what I mean? So you'd have like, I can stretch and also read minds. Oh, okay. So I guess I can stretch my head up to a window and read someone's mind. I don't know. Like, it was just, you'd get a lot of randomness, which on occasion you could get something very imaginative, but a lot of the times you just ended up with reject characters that they weren't kind of complementing themselves very well,
right.
I guess. I
Yeah.
don't know how to sort of put it.
Well, you're right, but that didn't bug me because when you think about like actual superheroes tend to work like that. Like you think about, he has the speed and strength proportionate with a spider. He shoots webs, and he has ESP because all spiders have ESP. That's why you can never stomp on them. Like you can sort of fudge it. The problem we had with Marvel, and the best example ever, was we had a group where all of our characters were pretty massive. Without getting too much into how the mechanics worked, like I had a guy who could take as much damage as the Hulk.
Right.
One guy was an inventor. He was as smart as Reed Richards. Another
pretty
dude,
massive.
Yeah, another dude could shoot like lightning bolts and had powered armor that was comparable to Iron Man's. And then my buddy Tim rolled up a character that he named Target Boy the Human Hostage because his highest stat was average.
Oh, there you go.
Like he was, and for some reason, he was the one that always ended up right in the middle of like the big fights with the villains that are designed to deal with our guys. And and his powers were he had like feeble regeneration, which meant he healed as fast as a regular person. and he had a elemental collection, which meant that he could like summon up all of a certain element in the area like before him, and he had it at typical, which meant he could like say summon up a 5-pound brick of all of the like lead in the area. And I say that because the one game the bad guy sent in like a gang to take our characters out, a group of mercenaries, and of course they found Target Boy first, and that was his thing before they all opened up on him was, I'm gonna try to summon lead, and everybody's like, no, you're going to, don't worry. So...
And did every combat round end with "to the hospital"?
Yes, actually, yes, it did.
Well, that was, and therein lies the problem with that randomness. Yeah, it's like having a character like the Hulk, except you didn't get his invulnerability. So it's like, yeah, I'm really strong until someone hits me, and then I go down like a sack of potatoes. And that's, I think that was the frustration of that game. Like, right. In fact, the game almost encouraged you just to play pre-existing characters. Like you were just, I'm going to make up the Avengers and the Hulk's on it, but also like Wolverine's in there, and some character from the Defenders is there. Like the game sort of, a lot of the times I've noticed anyway, it seemed to kind of push subtly in that direction of like, you could make a character, or you could just take one of these and do what you will.
Yeah, because that was something that came around during like the second wave of the role-playing game history, when you started having more games based on pre-existing like settings. And that's exactly what happens. Like when you got your Marvel, your DC superheroes, they really did kind of, Marvel not so much, but DC really did kind of downplay the idea of making your own characters. That it was more set up to play the actual characters from the comic.
Well, they assumed you want to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so they give you the stats for all the major characters from the comic, and oh, by the way, in case you want to, here's like actual rules for making your own. But who wants to do that?
Yeah, basically.
Although,
and Rob, you own the DC Heroes game.
Yeah, right? I have a copy of the second edition of the DC Heroes. I got copies of second, third, and what would technically be fourth.
And I seem to recall you telling me once before that like it was actually a very balanced, very well thought out game, but the only downside was that character generation took for flippin' ever.
Yes.
Or am I thinking of something else?
Well, there's a couple games like that. That's actually a very common complaint. In fact, actually, that goes back to one of the major complaints about Champions that you brought that up. Champions, we actually should go back a tiny bit. Champions, which I mentioned earlier, and V&V, are both actual good examples of something that was going on back in the late 70s, which was Villains and Vigilantes followed the Dungeons and Dragons line, which basically meant you generally rolled up your characters. Although V&V had an interesting one where you could actually just make yourself as a superhero and then add powers. In fact, actually, the original V&V intended you to do that, Villains and Vigilantes. Champions, on the other hand, was one of the very first games, I don't think it was the first, but one of the first, to use a point system, where characters got a certain number of points, and they could allocate them in different ways to buy powers or raise stats or things like that as a way to control your characters so they all ended up being roughly the same level or roughly equal to each other. And from there, two different concepts of role-playing, I guess you get character design would evolve. You would end up with the line that Champions follows and would be followed by GURPS later on and several others, which is point-based. The Chaosium system, I believe, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu, I believe they also followed the point-based thing, or something similar to it anyway.
They did, you rolled your stats, and then you spent however many points you got from that on your skills.
Oh, okay. They separated it that way, right?
Yeah, they kind of split the diff.
Although they did have their own, they did have Super World, which was their superhero role-playing game, which was basically their version of Champions, and they also used points for powers as well, and such in there. But anyway, so that role-playing games would kind of split off into this one line that focuses on almost, you could say, balance and tends to be points oriented, and one line that tended to be more about random and seeing what you could come up with.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where role-playing games went, at least as they went from their what we call the golden age into their silver age of the 1980s.
And as you said, like the ones that used the point-based system were slow to make your characters up.
Yeah, they were very slow because you had to think it through, right? It became an exercise in doing your taxes or doing your homework, as has already been said in a lot of ways.
Some were, some weren't. I mean, one of the problems that made making a character in Champions take so long is there's so much math.
Right, yeah.
Like there's so many substats that you have to calculate after you've allotted your points to your main stats, and then you can add points to change those and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So Villains Vigilantes didn't really have that problem until you had to figure out how much your character could lift.
Yes, V&V did have a few calculated stats that were incredibly complex.
Well, they weren't that bad. It was just multiply by, a decimal. But no, that strength formula, which is like an 8-point equation, you're like, what the fuck is this?
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, that's true. But I will tell you, Champions did amazing things in high school for my math skills. Like, even to this day, I'm incredible with fractions. As long as we're talking about fractions that are in 0.25. In increments of 0.25, I am a math master. And it's because I made so many darn Champions characters. And you had to know that.
It was interesting that you could... It just allowed you a lot of very precision-based character generation.
Yeah.
Like you could do something like a guy who was practically immune to fire, but you could still punch him and knock him out.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was... Yeah, I really liked that, that ability to go in and pinpoint like that. Whereas, something where you're just randomly rolling dice and going, okay, now you can, you can make things invisible. Mm-hmm. It's not, you know what I mean? Like you can actually create a character where like his powers complement each other and, there's a certain amount of, like the thing makes a certain amount of sense, I guess.
Right.
Yeah,
I will say, just sorry to interrupt, but Villains and Vigilantes, at least by second edition, I don't know if first edition did this, did actually have the thing where you were supposed to roll up, was it like you rolled like 1d6 plus 2 powers, wasn't it?
Yep. 1d6 and a weakness.
And a weakness, yeah. But then you got rid of those extra 2, or at least one of the extra 2. It was assumed that you were going to end up with a couple of weird ones that didn't fit together with the others. So there was some attempt to let things, balance out. I think they also might have had, I don't remember, did they have a thing, Don, where there were a few powers that you could actually sacrifice another power to get a better version of it or get a modified version of it? Or am I thinking of Marvel that did that?
Yeah, okay, you're kind of thinking sideways about both.
Okay.
Villains and Vigilantes was like D6 plus 1 or D6 plus 2. When you rolled for what your actual powers were, you had to drop 1. And then if you wanted to drop your weakness, you had to drop another power.
Right.
Whereas what Marvel did is if you had the Ultimate Powers book, you rolled your powers, and then you would get a bonus power, which there was the bonus power and there was an opposing power. The opposing power is just for the Game Master. It was an indication of this power will directly oppose that one.
Right.
But if you've got bonus powers or optional powers, instead of rolling for one of the one, because you rolled for how many powers you rolled for in Marvel, you could automatically use one of the slots for an optional power.
Right. Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Because I got to say, I kind of prefer the totally random stuff. Because I found, especially for superhero games, you'd always get people like, okay, I'm gonna make my character, and he's like got regeneration and berserker rage and claws that'll cut through anything, and it's like,
and he's Canadian.
Yeah, and they're like, again, really? You're making this again, really?
Yeah, everyone makes Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, or Wolverine. That's true.
Yeah, and that's why it's random. Okay, now use your imagination and figure out how this works. So I can fly, I have fire breath, and I can change the color of things. Yeah, there you go. Okay, now you figure out how to get used to and it was just nice because it broke people out of their rut.
Yeah.
Now go fight crime. No.
If Target Boy can do it, you can do it.
Right.
I think that. See, I agree with you, Don, to a point, which was the random stuff was fine until you got the dud character, and then it wasn't so. I found it wasn't as fun anymore because you're kind of a liability at that point, or
That's very true. The other issue with the points-based system in Champions really came down to equipment. because a lot of games where you use points, especially superhero games where you use points, you're using points to buy your super equipment.
Yeah.
Well, what about the character that just picks up a gun? Like that actually during the game, that was an actual issue that came up in Champions games that I ran. Well, characters are picking up equipment that are suddenly equal to the other character had to pay points for.
Yeah.
So how does that work? And the answer usually was you were allowed to carry the gun, but by the end of the game you had to give it up and you'd have to find a new one the next game or something because that's not part of your quote-unquote default character.
Yeah.
That was the general way they handled it.
I think also they were sort of intending you to not have just a gun, but a gun that could change the molecular consistency of things. Like it wasn't just a pistol.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think the intent was it's a sword, but it can cut through diamond and shoot fireballs, not just something you ran into a museum and picked up.
Exactly. But if you were, say, playing a Punisher ripoff, you would all your equipment was like normal standard M16s and rocket launchers and all this other stuff. But another character could pick that up off a villain's minions during the story and be doing the exact same thing. Now, mind the Punisher character again does get to start out each adventure with all that equipment, whereas the other guy doesn't. But that's really the only main advantage, and he can still have it taken away because it's equipment.
Yeah.
I see.
So that was a problem that point-based systems could very easily be overwhelmed. Yeah. At least point-based superhero systems could easily be overwhelmed by equipment and how to deal with equipment.
Yeah,
that to me was their other great flaw. And I say this as someone who ran many point-based role-playing games and such. And that's one consistent problem that I came across. There are a few exceptions. I mean, you could just ignore it. That was always an option. That's kind of what if I remember the DC Heroes one, the Mayfair DC Heroes one did that, where basically you just ignore if characters pick up equipment during the game, that's fine. You have the stats for it, that's fine, no problem.
I seem to recall, Rob, that you'd also have fun with it. Like, do you remember the period in time where we were doing the Adventures of the Beneficial Few, which was really goofy superhero stuff, and one of our players rolled up a character who was like a parody of the Punisher, who all of his abilities were based around guns that he always just had on him. So even if you took them away, he just had another pair behind his back.
Right, yeah.
And so he could fly, for example, because he would just point a pair of Uzis at the ground and fire them, and he would kind of lift them into the air.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he could do all these weird... And that something normal equipment couldn't do, but he could do it because he paid points for them.
Exactly.
He'd get away with that.
And yeah, for every shotgun you took away, you just had another one on him somewhere, So you could never truly get rid of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, he'd just pull them out. Where did you get that gun from? None of your damn business. Let's go.
I don't want to say.
So point-based systems definitely had their issues, but overall they could produce some really good stuff, and I think that they were almost a necessity for superhero gaming. Don obviously disagrees slightly. I mean, and there is some fun to rolling up your characters randomly. Except for the fact that most games are, if you'll pardon my language, filled with cheating bastards. There's always a couple of cheating bastards in every role-playing game who manage to roll sixes across the board. It's amazing how they do it.
Yes, it's also interesting. There's a correlation between those players and where they're often sitting, often in a corner somewhere when they're rolling out their characters, where no one can see what they're doing.
Exactly. They turn their back, they kind of wander off into the corner, and when they come back, all their stats out of 18 are like 17, 18, 17, 18, 16.
There's a 30 in there somewhere.
We had a guy do that once that he did this twice. Once for our group, once for another group he was playing. Because the game master of the other group said, "Did you see him roll up this character?" I'm like, "Why?" And she's like, "Well, because he said he rolled it in front of you guys, and we went through, and he maxed every single roll except intelligence, where he rolled like one less than the maximum you could have rolled."
Right.
And then there was another game we were playing. Palladium, and he made a ninja from Ninjas and Super Spies because that's how you win.
Yes.
And again, every stat was maxed out, but what we did that is we combined all the games, so everything they ran into had MDC.
Better explain what that is.
Yeah, which for those of you who don't know, in a Palladium system, mega damage, MDC, mega damage capacity, represents like your super hard alien metals like you see in all the sci-fi movies that our weapons just can't hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And when we did the game, because he had rolled up like a character from the regular game, he did normal damage, and nothing he ran into during that game, he could just walk up and kung fu it to death.
Poor guy.
Well, it was pretty good, because even though he I can't prove it, but we highly suspect that he cheated on the character and picked the most massive thing there was.
Mm-hmm.
When he ran into the MDC stuff, because he had the ninja character, he had enough like weird powers and abilities, and he was pretty good at coming up with new uses for them, that he actually it made it more of a fair fight.
Right.
Because he could do weird things to, say, the guys in the armor, and use ninja tricks and come up with all these complicated plans. So it worked out pretty good. Mm-hmm. And to his credit, he didn't complain when I basically had made all of his major abilities useless.
Right. That's pretty good. That's rare for a player to do.
Well, especially the kind of guy that fudges the rolls, as we say.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they lose their shit when something comes up that negates that.
Right. One of the best ways to handle that for like D&D style games that I ever saw was there was an option. I don't know. It's just I not official one, I don't think, but it's for D&D style games where basically what the characters have, say, 6 stats, and you just give them a set of numbers. You just give them like what is it? A 16, a 15, a 14, 2 10s, and an 8 or something like that for the 6 numbers, and they just allocate them wherever they want. So,
okay, that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then that prevents rolling, and it makes sure that every character has at least the potential to be really good at something, and they're good at one area where they're going to kind of suck.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the best ways I saw to do it. Now, of course, I imagine most gamers hated that idea because it meant that they couldn't, have the chance to roll up, Superman. But the thing is, I think that actually is a pretty good way to do it. At least looking back on it from the ways I saw. I don't remember ever actually doing it in a game myself, but I did see it done once. I'm trying to remember what game did. There was a game that did that, not D&D, but there was an actual game.
There's actually a lot of games that if you roll up stats, they'll give you that option.
Right, okay.
That they suggest that.
Right. And I think that is a good system.
Yeah, it can. The only problem I find for say, like, a power gamer, a guy who likes to maximize all of his stats and build the super kicking ass character, it's only a problem if the rest of the group doesn't do that too.
Right.
Because especially for a combat oriented game, you want all the players roughly equal wherever that level is, because then it's not like the bad guys show up and you have to have like Almighty Zeus and his toddler henchman for the rest of the group because one guy's super massive.
Which happened a lot.
Yeah, and that's where I say it's all about because oh my god, another funny story. We played one game where the group, the intent was they were going to be this like team of like super commando special forces character types.
Right.
And they rolled terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Like we said, okay, you're still like military guys, but wow, your stats are terrible. Your characters are weenies. I'm gonna hit you. And one guy in the group got this weird idea when we're like picking equipment. He's like, "Can my character have a girlfriend?" And we're like, "Yeah, okay, sure." And everyone's like, "Yeah, can my character have a girlfriend too?" And we rolled up their girlfriends, and the girlfriends had like max stats and massive abilities. And everybody's like, "Can we play them instead?" And I said, "No, you're playing the weenies. That's just kind of how it went." And it was a good campaign. Like, they sucked, but they all sucked. So you could like you could play, like Pauly Shore in the army as a campaign.
Right.
It wasn't like one guy rolled up Nick Fury and everybody's like, which end do I point? So
actually, I found some of the best games that I ran tended to actually be ones where the players were really, I don't want to say losers, but they were not very high-level characters. Mm-hmm. And they were basically, so they knew that they couldn't attack the world and just had to kind of work their way through it.
Right.
One of my very favorites was I ran, you guys both know about this. There was a game of the game Rifts, which is basically a post-apocalyptic kitchen soup role-playing game, for those who aren't familiar with it, by Palladium Games, where giant magical rifts opened up, and so the world is this giant post-apocalyptic place with magic and dragons and cyborgs and mecha and basically everything, like I said, the kitchen sink thrown into this one setting. And it's a completely horrific, chaotic setting where anything literally can and does happen, usually to your characters. And in Rifts, usually you build these like massive godlike characters that go out into this chaos and usually like create order. But the game that I ran was what I refer to as the Rifts Farmers campaign, which was basically the Magnificent Seven, except for the characters weren't the Magnificent Seven; they were the farmers set out to find the Magnificent Seven. And so they had to go out into the world, and they were literally a group of just country hicks from a village that was being raided by these like cyborg mice, and that had mega damage, so they couldn't hurt them. And they had one actual weapon between them. The one guy had a blaster rifle, did like a D6, which is in the game is basically a joke. And they went out into this horrific, chaotic fantasy world to try to find actual people that could come back to their village and would like save them from these like marauders. And that was one of my favorite games that I've ever run in my entire life, partly because the players, they couldn't fight their way through anything. And they constantly had to figure out ways to solve the problems and to deal with this incredibly dangerous setting, but do it in a way that they had to think through and solve their problems. Mm-hmm. And it was actually, and I thought that brought out the best in the characters and the best in the players. Really, I've done other similar games as well, and that usually tends to bring out the best in them when they can't just punch stuff to solve their problems or shoot stuff.
Right.
Well, don't most horror games operate off of that sort of thing?
That's true.
Yeah,
they do, but the horror games have a slightly twisted version of that, where if you're in a horror game, yeah, you have to assume that everything can and will eat you that you encounter.
Yeah.
When I run, I tend to run more a little adventure style, even though the risk setting can be taken as horror. Mm-hmm. But you're right, the horror games, yeah, like Call of Cthulhu being the perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which Call of Cthulhu is famous for its first edition not having any healing rules.
Yeah.
To be fair, you were never going to use them anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing, right? They did a whole edition of a game, play tested it, released it for years, and nobody thought that it was strange that there was no rules for characters healing or recovering.
Yeah, because you're done.
Yeah, if the monster you're investigating catches you, you're dead anyway. There's no getting away from it. So
it's just instant kill. So yeah,
although we had Cthulhu characters that lasted surprisingly long.
Mm-hmm.
There was one Doak ran, called him Ernie Sick because he rolled like pathetically low for Constitution, and Ernie Sick wouldn't die. Like holy no, just. Because when I run a horror game, I run straight up. So if the dice say you're done, you're done. Because horror is supposed to be this arbitrary, terrible universe that's just waiting to step on you. So sure. And Ernie wouldn't die. He got poisoned by Black Widow spiders at one point, and his Constitution dropped to 1, which is the minimum to keep somebody alive, which is like the dude in the iron lung that has to be wheeled around by the rest of the group. But he wouldn't die.
Is it to the point where like even the monsters started feeling sorry for him so they wouldn't kill him? Like, they're running after him. He's like, oh, my sciatica. And they kind of roll their eyes and go, oh, fine, just keep going.
Yeah, all right, just go.
Yeah, it sure felt like that, but yeah.
That happens sometimes, right? There are some characters that, even though that they technically shouldn't, they just the dice are just with them. They just have the luck of the gods, and it literally is just literal random chance or whatever, and they just keep succeeding when they shouldn't be succeeding.
I'm thinking of Target Boy again.
You're right. Yeah, exactly. And they keep surviving things again and again, and it's just like, how are you? What's going on here? Has God decided He likes you? What's going on here?
But this is Call of Cthulhu. God hates you. It's in the rule book.
Exactly.
Okay, so we discussed up to second wave games? Are we at third wave now, or where are we?
We're basically okay. Well, second wave, I believe you could say, starts with what? It starts with AD&D.
Well, do you want?
I guess.
Do you want the quickity rundown?
Sure, that might be the best way.
Okay, I've got it. Now, this is just my own personal way that I look at it. So if anybody disagrees, feel free to send us angry emails. I got it that there's basically 4 eras, and each era has 2 phases.
Okay.
And they correspond more or less to the decade. So the 1970s begins with Dungeons and Dragons. And it's the first official role-playing game proper. It kicks everything off. By the second half, you have, if you know anything about comic books, what I call small press role-playing games.
All right.
That the role-playing games that came out were typically pamphlet-sized. They were fairly cheaply printed. You're talking maybe 36 pages. Kind of doggedy artwork, because a lot of times it'd just be a friend of the author or the author themselves just doing their best.
Would this be the kind of stuff you'd see advertised in Dragon Magazine, which was a magazine about D&D at the time when D&D was around, popular, I guess? You know what I mean? At its popularity in the 80s kind of thing.
Yeah.
But is that the kind of games you're talking about? Like,
yeah, that was a lot of it. A lot of the games that came out at that time, like I say, the production values weren't real high. And a lot of them were, like the original D&D, the rules and the setting were pretty threadbare, because it was assumed, like, if you played Dungeons and Dragons, you were already a sword and sorcery fan. That's what brought people to the game. You knew the tropes, you knew how things worked, so they didn't give you a lot of that in the book. The book was just, here's some basic rules, you figure it out yourself, you'd add your own, you'd come up with your own setting, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
The second era starts, I'd say sometime around 1981, and it's just after the Satanic Panic starts, because that's when you suddenly have this big influx of fans, like people trying out role-playing games. There's a big expansion in topics. That's where you start getting like more horror, you get your science fiction stuff, and you get higher production values. There's more emphasis on art. Palladium started the idea of the square-bound paperback book, which you start seeing other companies do, because it's relatively inexpensive, but it still looks pretty good. During that era, you get a lot of games from the earlier times coming back in new editions, like Villains and Vigilantes. The one everybody remembers is second edition. It's not first edition, which had a small print run, and again was one of these like kind of cheaply put together books. And then the second part of the second era is when you start getting games that are part of some other license. Like they did Marvel, they did DC, Palladium did the Turtles game. They also did Robotech, which was their big breakout hit. Prior to that, most games that came out were the author's own idea or a rip-off of something else. You had Call of Cthulhu. That was kind of the first mass market game, but it was still kind of small. And then as a result of, say, getting like the Marvel game, it comes with a setting. So the game included more detail about setting, more detail about characters, and that spilled into the other games. So people who were actually writing their own stuff were now starting to flesh out the setting and flesh out the ideas of behind who the characters are, which prior to that, in like the first wave, was up to the players. It was assumed you'd come up with that on your own. Then the third wave is it's in the 90s. And by 89, 90, 91, you had companies that were putting out games that had more of an emphasis on the story part. The White Wolf, when they did their World of Darkness, that was kind of the start of that, where it was more about the characters as dramatic persona rather than ambulatory stats. You had more stripped down rules, because a lot of the game would be more negotiated, I guess you'd say, between the game master and the participants. One of the side effects and downsides of that was you had people who were frustrated writers that would write role-playing games. And
I think that's always been part of it, actually.
it has, but it got more pronounced because you'd buy a role-playing game that like a third of it would be short stories, which is fine and dandy. And then because of that, the setting would be so well fleshed out as game master, you're not actively adding that much to it. And then,
What's an example of that? Like, give me a game example of that, because this might have been past the point where I was playing them anymore.
okay, well, a lot of the White Wolf stuff eventually got to that because they do like Vampire. And Vampire is pretty good, and they do some settings, and they do the different clans of Vampire. And those were pretty good, and they had, because you had a decent, well thought out story behind it, but there was still a lot of play that the participants in the game could add their own things to. But then they'd start putting out books that would get more increasingly specific, so it wouldn't just be this clan of vampires are like business guys, but this clan of vampires is led by Bob, and Bob lives here, and this is what Bob has for breakfast. And then you're not really adding to that. It's because the person writing it is telling their own story, and a role-playing game is about facilitating the story of the participants.
Oh, okay.
So the downside, of course, is that you will eventually run out of stuff to sell people. I mean, you'll detail everything that can be detailed, and eventually, like, well, what do we do now?
Yep.
You can actually over-detail a setting, in fact.
Yep. And then that kind of leads... Okay, the second part of the third wave in the 90s was the D20 system, which was the upgrade to Dungeons & Dragons, which brought back more of the rules focus to things. Whereas prior to that, it was more the story focus. The mechanics were secondary. And then when you get to the fourth era, which is the 2000s, that's where you sort of start running into some of the things that you're talking about, because when you get to, say, the 2000s, games tended to be, if not more detailed mechanically, the rules tended to be more focused because you had this wargame influence that came from the D20 system, and the collectible card games, war games, all of that had a surge during the 90s. And then getting to the problem that you've mentioned, one of the things that started happening in the 2000s was a lot of companies would bring out new editions of old games, and it really became a thing that each edition of your game would push the setting along.
Okay.
Right.
The best example of that would be, like, say, Shadowrun. Shadowrun comes out in the 80s. The game is set in 2050. They do the second edition, which is basically first edition. The rules are a little different. They flesh out the setting a little more. It takes place in 2054. Third edition takes place in, like, somewhere around 2060. And the setting has changed. They just had this big presidential election. The dragon that got elected was assassinated. The corporate wars start. Everything, the setting is now different along with the mechanics. Then they do, like, fourth edition, which I think is, like, 2072. And the mechanics are a little different. It's further along in the timeline of the setting. So it's almost like you're doing a new game each time, but still tying back to the older stuff.
Huh, okay.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
Okay, and then things seem to wax and wane, because something that's happened since the 2000s that you didn't touch on is there is actually another stage of game that's happened, where what's happened is that, well, there's been a split. I guess the split technically occurred in the 90s with LARPing, like the live action role playing and such. But there started to become a focus more on narrativist games. Okay. Which we'll talk about more in another podcast. But narrativist games are basically games that are just completely story driven. Where the players, they started coming out with games where progressively the players had more and more power. And to the point where there are games actually that exist now where there are no GMs, there are no game masters.
Yeah.
The players take either a role, they either game by consensus. In other words, what happens is based on what everyone decides, or in some cases they have a rotating GM. Whichever player is not active at the moment is acting as a kind of referee or GM for that scene. But again, the story is still one that's created by consensus rather than an actual GM like directing and refereeing.
Yeah.
And those types of games have been popular since the mid-2000s or so. Now, they are kind of, again, another kind of parallel development that's been happening with role-playing games, and are in some ways a reaction to the more rules-heavy stuff. So games of tabletop role-playing has kind of divided again into the rules-heavy and the narrativist.
Yeah.
If I'm using the term right, narrativist might not be the correct term, but I'm going to go with it anyway. My friend Graham can correct me later. And so that's kind of the current evolution or state of gaming as it is, which could almost... I'm not sure whether that would count as the fourth age. Like, you could say that there's a fourth age fifth age that's the narrativist. Or whether you could actually just say it's running in parallel with the fourth age tabletop stuff.
Yeah, it's because that kind of stuff really does come from the live action gaming, which comes from the more story-oriented stuff that you saw back in the 90s.
Right, yeah.
And
yeah.
It's always there. Nothing totally goes away. Even when the D20 thing hit and everything was all about, more detailed wargamey rules, that stuff still went on. And the kind of games you're talking about, they're still kind of a subset, because gaming, like role-playing games, like most forms of entertainment, I think are still waiting for the next big thing. So when you say they're fragmented, you're right. Like, there's no consolidation of those kind... Because I know the kind of games you're talking about.
Right.
There's no consolidation of those yet where they've moved to the front. And I think it's because it's really difficult to put together a good group that are all like-minded enough to play that kind of thing without punching each other in the throat.
I think so. Also, there's another inherent problem to them. I don't think they work very well for, and this is my opinion, we can be corrected later on, I don't think they work well for campaigns. I've noticed a lot of narrativist games tend to be what I would call narrow games, which are basically games that are designed for players to play through a particular scenario.
Right.
You could almost call them an evolution of the whole murder mystery dinner thing.
Well, and that's kind of what the live action stuff was.
Yeah. And so there are certain set goals and certain situations that are happening, and you just kind of go through that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the narrativist games are like. There's one, for example, the famous one I know of was one called The Mountain Witch, where the players were a group of samurai that are going up a mountain to try to hunt down some witch that's been terrorizing a valley or something. It's it's the heroic knights going up, but there are a whole bunch of complications and such. But the whole game is literally written just to play out that one scenario.
Yeah, but they don't...
It's not a generic game.
Yeah, they don't have to, though, because Cosmic Patrol is the same kind of game, and they do all kinds... They've had all kinds of different supplements and that come out.
Right.
So that's more of a nature of the specific game, I think, than the medium of those kind of games.
I could see that.
Because I know what you're talking about, Rob. Actually, there's a game called Mutant Future. I downloaded off. Someone had actually put up a copy of this thing just as a tryout version, and it is literally, if I'm remembering the name right, I think it is Mutant Year Zero. It's kind of a Gamma World post-apocalyptic game, but there's an actual ending to it. Like, it's not this open sort of sandbox environment. You're playing this very specific adventure, and then that's it.
Yeah,
and you can, and I guess you can play another, round of it again, down the road if you want, a new game, but it still ultimately ends that same end point.
Yeah, it's almost like you're going through a novel,
right,
or a movie or something, and what's happening is you're
module,
or module. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's true. In a way, actually, that's true. In a way, nothing's changed, right? It goes back to D&D modules. Yeah. But I will say in the defense, well, okay. Even gaming modules went through their evolution, where the very early ones were very literally on rails because you were going through the dungeon and you could only go through a certain way.
Yeah.
To stuff that was more open and more of an adventure where you could follow different routes, and then have gone back maybe I'm right, back to the whole on rails thing or hybrid. I don't know. The sad truth, I'm going to make a confession. I pretty much got out of gaming in the mid to late 2000s.
We can't be friends.
I know, Don. I know. This is the end of the podcast, folks. I'm sorry. We can't work together anymore.
There won't be a holiday special episode. It's over.
Yep. I was going to say, look forward next week, folks, to the Rob and Chad podcast.
Exactly. And so, yeah, but it's true though. I mean, after gaming for about more than 20 years, more like 30 years almost. I basically kind of reached my saturation point, and maybe I'll get back into them someday. But I've taken a long hiatus from gaming. Let's put it that way. And so that's why I'm not that familiar with the current state of gaming. My gaming knowledge more or less mostly ends about the mid 2000s, and then through friends I know a little bit about what's happened after with the narrativist games and such.
Right.
Well, I'm not that different from you, Rob. I actually stopped when I got to college because I just didn't. There was no one I knew that played them anymore, right? And I kind of keep a sort of a peripheral view of them. Like, if I go into a store or something, I see some. I often pick one up and flip through it, kind of thing. But
right, yeah.
There was a whole thing, I guess, with a fantasy game called Pathfinder that I had no experience with that, but that seems to be kind of a lot of people's go-to.
Yeah.
Back in the day, it was D&D, and the current generation seems to be Pathfinder.
Well,
Pathfinder is D&D
with a different name. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
No, literally, it is.
Literally, it's D&D. What happened is, if I remember right, I can be corrected. They created D&D version 3, also known as the D20 system, and eventually D&D moved on to D&D updated version 3.5, and then D&D moved on to D&D version 4, which used a completely new set of rules, so they could re-release all their books and everything. But people didn't want to give up D&D 3.5 or 3, whatever. They didn't want to give it up. So what happened is that the TSR, or actually they're owned by Hasbro, sub-licensed the rules for D&D out to another company, Paizo Publishing, I believe it was, or is, and they created their own version called Pathfinder, which is really D&D 3 point whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So really that is D&D. It is. It's just licensed by a separate company and uses a separate brand name, but it's D&D.
Yeah.
D&D 3.0.
Or it's more like 3.6.
Okay, we can work with that.
So,
and what is D&D up to right now? 5?
5 is coming out soon if it's not out already.
Yeah, because 4 basically changed things. So 4 made things more like a
video game.
Yeah, like a video game. They basically tried to turn D&D into a pen and paper, massively multiplayer role-playing game.
Yeah.
Wait, hold on. I think 5 already came out then, because I remember... wasn't there like a big relaunch for the whole thing just like this past year?
Yeah, that'd be 5. I saw them talking about it, but I stopped at 3. 3 is fantastic. I don't need 15 more versions of D&D.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. They more or less perfected, one may argue this, D&D with 3.
Yeah.
D&D,
Right.
the 3 is probably the most perfect version of D&D they've ever created, and they made a ton of stuff for it. And then they moved on to, they did the Microsoft thing. They moved on to 4 and said, okay, guys, come on, let's go to 4. And everyone said, no, we're happy with 3. Screw you.
Yeah, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's basically what happened. So
Yeah, I guess mine would have been what? What was the red box? 1? And I guess Advanced D&D was 2.
1.5, I guess, would be the red box.
Well, that's where, if you really want to get technical, AD&D is technically the 3rd edition of D&D.
Okay. Okay.
Red Box was 2. 2nd edition was the 4th edition. 3rd edition was the 5th. 3.5 was the 6th. 4 was 7. So D&D version 5 is actually the 8th version of the game.
Cheapers.
Yep. By the way, 4th edition came out in 2008. 5th edition came out in 2014. 5th edition has actually been out for 2 years, guys. We just didn't notice.
Oh, wow.
Or at least maybe a year and a half. Who knows?
So are they gearing up for a 6th edition? I'm assuming they are.
Probably. They must be, because they keep trying to do the old Microsoft Windows Update thing.
Yeah.
Hoping. See, all they need to look at they got it all wrong. All they need to do is put the red box back out again with some different art on it.
They did.
They did that.
No. I know, but I'm saying that you advertise that as 6th edition.
Right.
Well, no, they advertise as classic because they put out white box the little pamphlets, the very original. They reissued that a couple years ago.
Oh, so they're pulling the same stunt that Coca-Cola did back in the day with Coke Classic.
Sort of,
Yep.
but what keeps kind of biting them in the ass is everybody likes the old versions better than the new ones. And there are people right now that are releasing supplements for the white box D&D.
Mm-hmm.
That's funny.
You can do
It
that.
Yeah, I've picked up a few of them because they're actually really nifty.
I believe it.
Oh, okay. Well, how about this, guys? Why don't you go through like Rob? What would be like, say, your favoriteest RPGs that you can think of that you have like a fondness for?
Well, as was mentioned earlier, of course, I didn't take to fantasy gaming. Actually, I wasn't a big fantasy fan to begin with. I have a fondness for fantasy, but I don't have the great love of it that many people do. So that's why D&D didn't strike a chord with me. But superheroes, I loved superheroes when I was a teen. I was a huge comic book fan. And so when I discovered superhero gaming, I truly fell in love. And so for me, the majority of the role-playing games that I love are superhero games. Villains and Vigilantes, 2nd edition. Champions. As we've discussed, I ran Champions for like almost 20 years. On and off, I ran Champions. Champions, also known now as the hero system. And so that to me, because I could do anything with it. I've always been fond of role-playing games that let me come up with my own story, and then the rules just served as a way to play out that story.
Right.
Not that I was a GM, because I always preferred game mastering or GMing over playing, because I always found I enjoyed more. I enjoyed playing God, I guess you could say. The power. The power! So as an end result, I also liked creating my own settings and creating story and that. So I was drawn mostly to games that let me do that, like Champions, for example. I also very fond of DC Heroes Mayfair Edition role-playing game. 3rd edition was probably my favorite for that one. Again, I think only once did I ever actually use DC Heroes 3rd edition for playing a superhero game.
Yeah.
A proper one. I've used it to run a Star Trek campaign. I've used it to run a kind of fantasy superhero game that I did. It was a like magical girls thing that I did with a group of players back in the Sailor Moon days in the 90s. I guess that's technically superhero. I did run a proper superhero game with it once. I think I've done one or two other things with it, but I very rarely used it because the DC, again, it's a system that you can do almost anything with. It just depends on what you want to do with it. And those GURPS, again, generic universal role-playing system. You're probably seeing a trend here. So, I've tended to like games that were not for specific setting or specific genre, except for superhero, obviously. There are 2 exceptions that I can think of offhand. I'm a huge 3 exceptions. The three games that I fell in love with their specific are Mechton, which was a giant robot mecha, role-playing / combat game.
Right.
Mechton Zeta was my favorite one there. Cyberpunk, also by Altusorian Games. I loved Cyberpunk back in the day. Never got not into Shadowrun, but I never had a good group to play with, so that's probably why. And the only other game I can think of that I became really fond of for a while, there was a game called Weapons of the Gods, which was a Chinese wuxia role-playing game. And it was created by, it's based on a Chinese comic called Weapons of the Gods, but it's actually, the game itself was actually made by Americans. It was actually created by Americans. And that was a pretty amazing game. It was meant for playing really high-level martial arts, like, characters flying around and doing all sorts of weird martial arts. That was actually a really awesome game. I don't think it's in print any longer, but that was actually a truly awesome game. There was a similar game that came around at the same time called Exalted that I was a little bit fond of. That was more of a Western wuxia type game system. I think Exalted is still around. And I was fond of I think it was the 2nd edition of that. That was not bad. I think I only ran it once though, but it wasn't too bad. There are lots of other games I've played. I mentioned Rifts. In my time, like 30 years of gaming, I've played or ran almost every game on the market. But But those are my favorites, I guess you could say. My favorites, again, going back to it, are the generic ones that I myself can customize and tinker with to do whatever I want with. Turning it back on you, Chad, what are your favorite games?
Yeah.
I would say that actually looking back over all the games that I really enjoyed, and a lot of times these weren't even games I even played, I just owned them, and I wish I could have played them. Like, I may have played them once in a while, but, never had, like, long campaigns where I tended to be sort of drawn towards the odder games that had, like, weird ideas in them.
Okay.
So I loved second edition Gamma World, which was the gonzo post-apocalyptic game where, you could run around as a mutant polar bear with a stop sign for a shield. Mm. Like, I loved that. I just loved... And the setting was really nuts. And that's what I loved about it. The creatures were all bizarre. What was that thing you used to say, Don, about in that setting of that game... the term "keep off the grass," they mean it.
Oh, yeah, they mean it.
Because remember, the grass in that game can teleport explosive seed pods into your body.
If you get too close to it. Yeah. So I really loved that kind of craziness. There was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the game. Mm. That was Palladium's game. And again, it had that same weirdness. The setting of that game was very odd. Like, it was almost... I think, again, Don, you summed it up nicely as, like, it's like a bunch of weird mutant animals in a world where there's little pockets of mad science running amok. So the characters play as these kind of mutant creatures that are trying to stay out of the limelight or stay in the shadows and then dealing with oddball threats, Mm-hmm. There was that. A game I really had a huge fondness for was Beyond the Supernatural, which was a Palladium horror game, which... You played as, like, sort of psychic or psychic sensitive characters fighting monsters. And just some of the ideas in it were so nuts, and it was great. They had... there was a character class in that game called the Nega Psychic, who was like a stout disbeliever of anything supernatural. And by having that sort of, that sort of mindset, it actually in a weird about way protected them from supernatural things because they almost had like a psychic barrier in their head. So, like vampires couldn't mind control them because there's no such thing as vampires. So, you waving your hand in front of my face, that's not doing anything. It's that kind of thing. So I love that. Just that, I guess I was drawn towards, and that's, I think, why I always have a fondness for the Red Box, Dungeons and Dragons. There's sort of a kookiness to it. A kind of almost like fly by the seat of your pants, the world isn't terribly thought out. It's just almost random. You can have this little village and then down the road is a dungeon with monsters crawling in it.
Right.
And the two don't seem to, oddly enough, never overlap each other. So it's just that, and the monsters are kind of weird and, you had your standard dragons and stuff, but then you have some really oddball things like hook horrors, which were underground vulture monsters with hooks for hands. Like, just weird things like that. I just loved it. So I think that's where I tended to kind of focus more, was on anything that just had interesting ideas in it. But of course I also loved the superhero stuff too. That was pretty fun. But I think, Rob, only once we started goofing around with it and when we stopped taking it seriously.
Okay. Well,
when we did the Beneficial Few adventures,
yes,
which I mentioned earlier, it was basically we decided to make like really screwy superheroes. Like we had the Snowman and what were some of the other ones? The Taco Avenger and
the Taco Avenger. Yeah. No, was it the Nacho Avenger?
There's the Nacho Avenger.
The Nacho Avenger, because he had like an attack that he could spray out like cheese and stuff like that. Yeah.
There was the mall samurai who could, if he was in a mall, he was almost unstoppable. But if you got him outside of a mall, he was very weak.
Yep. If he was in malls, I remember that. Yeah, we would play those.
He could heal himself by eating food court food. So yeah. So the idea was to make these really gonzo characters and then put them up against like regular serious villains.
Yeah. And just see how they dealt with them.
I think wasn't the team based out of Hoboken? I seem to recall that.
I think you're confusing it with like the Superhero League of Hoboken, New Jersey. There was a computer game called the Heroes of Hoboken or something like that.
Oh, you're right. But I know we had it.
I thought it was based here. It was based in London, Ontario, I thought.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe it was.
I remember
It's
it being
weird.
based because I remember you guys having a fight in a mall, of course, Mall Samurai. There was an old mall called the Centertown Mall. That was basically a rundown mall in the center of the city. And I remember you guys had a fight there at one point in one of the games. Because that's where the villain was actually... the villain was basically hiding out. The bad guys were hiding out there. And you guys attacked them. And that was,
Okay.
And so the Mall Samurai's powers came into play. Essentially, at that stage, we were basically playing, was like the Tick, basically, role-playing game at that point.
Right,
I mean,
yeah. We were just having fun with it. Just the absurdity of superheroes,
Okay, and I remember that, although, ironically enough, that's not the stuff I remember fondly. I remember... For our game, because Chad and I played together as in high school, which we didn't know Dawn until later. I remember the V&V campaign that we played in your parents' basement, and that to me, that was it Dave Johnson was running it? I think it was.
No, I think I was.
Oh no, you were.
Actually.
You're right. You were. Yes, I remember you were writing. Yeah, you're right. You were running it. That to me was like one of the most significant gaming experiences of my life. That was one. I haven't played many campaigns that I truly loved, but that was one of the very few. And that was my first...
I think it's also... I think it was noteworthy because it also went on a long... Like, it was one of the... when you play these kind of games, what would happen is, if you had a group of people, and I'm sure you found this as well, Don, is that you sort of took... You'd play a game for a little bit, and then you'd take turns. Someone else would run a different game. Mm-hmm. So the campaigns never went on that long. But that one that Rob's mentioning is kind of noteworthy because it's one of the few cases where the game actually it went on for a pretty decent amount of time.
Yeah, at least a year, I think, or close to it.
Something like that, yeah.
We were playing every Sunday, and we went on all sorts of adventures. We got our butts kicked by all sorts of villains.
And I think also because it went on so long, it started becoming increasingly stranger. Of course, that's also my own taste.
There's that too, yeah. There's that too. Well, so as an end result, that campaign to me is like superhero gaming. Like in a lot of ways, that campaign was one of the things I always sought in my own superhero games to actually replicate. So I was, in a way, I was copying you as a GM, Chad.
Okay.
So that's that became one of the things anyway when I was doing superhero gaming that really stuck with me. And so anyway, so Dawn, how about you? What games are your favorites?
Wow. Okay. Well, not including Akrima City, which is the greatest role-playing game ever written.
Which we all know that, yes.
Yes, it is. There's so many. I think the ones that
Before someone Googles Akrima City, Don's talking about his own unpublished role-playing game that's been it's been in beta testing for like 20 years.
Yeah, something like that.
20 more and it'll be ready for publishing.
Yep.
You guys are going to make me cry. Anyway.
No, we're going to make you actually publish the damn game. That's what we're going to make you do.
Oh.
All right, sorry, continue.
Okay. Well, there's so many. I think the games over the years that I like the most is the original Chill.
Right? Oh, okay.
Which it's a horror game. It's basically, if you ever seen like any of the old Hammer House of Horror films, it's the role-playing game.
Right?
I loved that. Call of Cthulhu we played to death. Cyberpunk we played to absolute death.
Right.
I liked Torg. Torg was an interesting game.
What was that?
That was the one. It's kind of like backwards rifts. Like, the idea was that these extra-dimensional beings attack Earth because they feed on possibility energy, and Earth has unlimited possibility. And they'd slam down in an area and bring their own reality with them. And when their reality took over, it would limit the possibility, and they'd drain that bleed-off power for their evil machinations. So if you went to these different areas, the laws of physics work differently. So there's, if you go to the Middle East, it's this like pulp hero type land. And the rules for reality work differently. So basically, the more daring and over the top the action you try to do, the easier it is to do. So if your character tries tying his shoes, he's probably going to trip and hit his head. But if you want to jump from a helicopter onto a half track and punch out the Nazis on board, that's easy. You get all kinds of bonuses.
Okay.
And that was a good one. And I actually did like the 90s World of Darkness stuff.
Okay, why?
Which would be, what was that, and what was that exactly? Like,
Oh, it was they did a vampire, werewolf, mage.
Okay.
Like that. I enjoyed them because it was interesting. They were very emo,
Mm-hmm.
and I normally hate that. But they took the time in the setting to come up with reasons for it. So, for instance, vampires are all like these old-fashioned, trapped in the Victorian era, types, because their brains harden. That after a few hundred years, they lose like the mental flexibility to adapt to new times. And I thought that's a clever way of explaining why you see all these, like, you know, the diehard emo goth vampires are always these weird romantic era Victorian type things. Well, they made that make sense. And I thought that's brilliant, and it was entertaining for that.
That's cool. Okay.
I could totally see that. Yeah, and well, they did think them through. Yeah, they definitely thought through the World of Darkness games. I have one or two of them as well, and yep, they did a great job of thinking them through. Unfortunately, they became more derivative as they went, but that's because they were running out of ideas. There's only so much they could do with them. But the first ones were very well thought through. That's true.
Yeah, if you got basically the original book and the Game Master book for any of the ones they put out, those were great. And then sort of pick and choose what supplements you got into after that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Huh.
So, I think probably this is a good point to stop, since we're going to be coming back to this topic again, and we don't want to let this podcast go on for too much longer. Not this particular... We don't want to let this episode go on too long or we'll bore our audience, because the three of us could probably sit around and tell gaming stories, and we haven't even gotten to like the great campaigns we ran or any of that stuff like that. And so, although we've I think each touched on at least one of them anyway. And so I think we'd better, table this for now, and we'll come back at some point and talk about fantasy gaming and superhero gaming and horror gaming.
Yep.
So, any final thoughts, Don?
I don't know. I think the thing that I'd take away, since, like I say, and I'm going to puff up my nerd cred a little bit, since I consider myself like a 1.5 generation gamer, it is interesting to see how what used to got you like made fun of and prior to that exercised by the local priest has become such a prevalent, public, generally accepted kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I also find it funny that the people who used to laugh at me for playing Dungeons and Dragons are now obsessively watching it, that it's called Game of Thrones. So,
yeah, that's pretty good. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. They all went and saw Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and they're all like obsessing about Game of Thrones. Good point. If anything, I'm surprised Game of Thrones hasn't caused a huge new upswing in fantasy role playing.
Yeah, true.
But
also, didn't video games kind of wreck that, or like sort of undermine it?
I think they did. I think what's happening is, instead of doing fantasy role playing, they're all going and playing. I know World of Warcraft's not that popular anymore. Whatever the current popular fantasy massively multiplayer online game is, probably what they're doing instead, or
or just something on their Nintendo 3DS,
or they're playing a computer game. Yeah, they were playing computer games instead. Although I have heard that there is actually, or has been in the last couple of years, an actual bit of a renaissance and revival in tabletop role-playing going on.
Yeah.
I have heard that it's actually been coming back into vogue again for a little while, or has been for the last couple of years. So maybe Game of Thrones has been helping.
Yeah. And is that have anything to do with like sort of that weird resurgence with... it's not even a resurgence, it's just sort of this burst of like... of board games are very popular now.
Yep. An expansion on that, I think.
And war games.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true. I mean, it's very natural for people to start playing war games, especially the Warhammer game, for example. There's still Games Workshop stores. There's one here in London in a local mall. Kids go in there and play. I mean, and of course, we just had on a couple episodes ago, we had James Wegg of No Dice Games, and talking about card games and that. So people play the card games, they play the war games. And then, especially from the war games, it's very easy to graduate, ironically enough, just to role-playing games and tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah.
It's very easy to go from... It's it's kind of like a gateway drug in a lot of ways, I think, for a lot of people. Ironic that. How about you, Chad? Any thoughts about role-playing games before we get going?
Well, again, like you, Rob, it's been a very long time since I ever actually played one.
Mm-hmm.
I have a fondness for them, obviously, because there's a nostalgic aspect to them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more curious to see. I'm actually, to an extent, I'm actually amazed they're still around. I've noticed that they sort of mostly appear now online. Like there's a place called driveinrpg.com I came across, and it seems to really be promoting this idea of like, now if you just want to make your own game up and sell it, here's a place to do it, because, why bother putting out an actual, book when, a PDF would work just as well. And more people might actually, access your game that way than they would with a little hardcover actual printed matter.
That's true.
But it seems to me like that's what it's sort of evolved into.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become much more specialized now. Like it's, back in the 80s, I can remember walking into any given hobby store and there was always like a sizable role-playing game selection.
Oh, yes.
Like a rack, right? Like there was, nowadays, unless you go specifically to a board game store, you won't find that sort of thing anymore. You have to kind of look now a little harder if you want the physical ones.
Right. Yes.
What I'm saying. So maybe this is just sort of its natural evolution.
I could see that.
Is to do that.
Makes sense.
Right?
That's true. I guess that's one way to look at it. Well, like anything, it waxes and wanes. I think we're going to get a bit of a this is just my final thoughts on. I think that the augmented reality and the virtual reality, what's the correct term? Revolutions that are coming. The developments and those technologies that are coming are as usual going to encompass role-playing games. I mean, if you can literally through virtual reality go on a first-person adventure with your friends and that, I mean, that's pretty awesome, right?
Right.
So we're going to see that, but at the same time, I have a feeling that's going to kill pen and paper and just doing it the old imagination way even more. Maybe. I'm wrong. On the other hand, augmented reality, I've already seen some people doing some neat stuff with where, people are doing, they're all wearing glasses or they all have like tabletop screens or whatever, and then they got dungeons mapped out, and so stuff is popping up on the dungeon. It creates it into a kind of augmented game board that you can play stuff on. So I've seen that too, and that might actually even encourage some like role-playing type stuff. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't think role-playing games are going to go away permanently. I think they actually are a part of human culture now. And I know that other cultures do actually play them, but again, we'll cover that in another episode. There are non-English speaking cultures that do play these things. But I don't think they're ever going to be as big as they were once upon a time during our teen years and such. I think they've kind of had their golden age, and I don't think another golden age of them is coming. That's my somewhat pessimistic take on them, but who knows? I hope I'm wrong.
Right.
All right, and on that incredibly depressing note,
Again,
yeah. Well, sorry to finish up on a depressing note. So, actually, Dawn, no, let's finish on a high note. So, Dawn, do you remember the story you told me about a game that you ran of Cyberpunk, where the guy was standing next to the pit going 23, 23, 23? Was it 23?
Oh.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell that story, and we'll finish on that? For some reason, that story has always stuck with me.
It's kind of old. Now, you remember the Cyberpunk one, but I've used this a lot of times in different games.
Right.
It's kind of an old joke, but I think it's when old people know, so the youngins might not. But they come up to this big crevice, and there's this
players.
guy. Yeah, the players group comes up, and this guy's staring into it, yelling, 23! 23! 23! They're like, what the hell's this guy doing? They're like, what are you doing? He's looking in the pit, and he looks over, looks back in the pit. 23! 23! One of the players is like, I'm going to go find out what this is. Goes over, looks into the pit, doesn't see anything. Squints his eyes, looks really hard. As he's looking, the guy pushes him from behind. Dude falls into the pit, dies. Original guy at the side starts yelling, 24! 24! 24! Yeah.
Sorry, that was I don't know why. That's always I've always found that incredibly funny, especially since I was never the character who fell in the pit. But we'll talk gaming stories in another episode. On that note, thanks for listening, everyone. Hopefully we've helped to resurrect a few gaming memories, and those of you who did some tabletop gaming in your own times, feel free to drop by our Facebook group, Operatives of the Department of Nerdly Affairs, or come to the website at obeythedna.com and post a comment. Tell us about your gaming experiences, and if we did bring back any memories for you. Or if you disagree with things that we talked about, feel free to comment on that too.
That works.
Okay, on that note, tune in next time to talk about something that's really cool and not in any way connected with Star Wars.
Although, you know what? For the Star Wars role-playing game D6 edition, I did do a holiday special supplement.
You did?
You're a very evil, evil man, Ron.
We'll talk about that another time as well. All right, good night, folks.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.